Can you hear me, Marcia?
You know,
Am I muted,
Marcia.
Marcia? Can you hear me, Marcia?
Marcia, you're on mute if you're trying to see if we can hear you.
Am I also on mute?
No, I can hear you fine now.
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you.
Joanne, can you hear me?
Yes, you're soft, but I can hear you.
Okie dokie.
Woo!
Right.
Woo! Thanks.
You're welcome.
Did we start yet?
No, nope.
Okay. Phew, good. Someday I'll get
We're
used.
starting in about 4 minutes.
Someday I'll get used to this game.
You're doing fine. Hello, James. Okay. By my clock, it's 5 o'clock. I'd like to call the meeting of the Board of Appeals for the Town of Tremont to order. We'll do a roll call, make sure everybody's here. Joanne Harris, Bass Harbor. Mel,
Mel Atherton, Grass Harbor.
Mike,
Mike Hayes, Bass Harbor.
Rick,
Richard Cohen, Seal Cove.
Marcia?
Marcia Madeira, Bernard.
Okay, 5 out of 5 are here. We have a quorum. Any adjustment to our agenda, which is essentially a continuation of last Thursday's Board of Appeals meeting, where we heard the public portion. I closed the public portion, and tonight is intended for our deliberation on the appeal. On behalf of the concerned Tremont residents, appeal of the planning board decision to approve Acadia Wilderness Lodge, that decision rendered November 1st, 2021. Any adjustment to that, to the agenda? Seeing and hearing none. And Jesse, I assume any public notification as was appropriate and we're good to go.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Okay. It's my understanding, members of the board, that our job tonight is to go through each of the 8 appeals presented on behalf of the concerned Tremont residents. We are then to look at the findings of fact that the planning board rendered in their decision making. We can then discuss it, and I will then entertain a motion on each of those items. Whether or not to accept the appeal and I guess remand that back to the planning board, or to dismiss the appeal and find in favor of Acadia Wilderness Lodge. James, is that about the way we should proceed?
It's not how I would describe it, but that's as good a methodology as any. I think I don't know if this is semantics or substantive, but I would say you go through each appeal matter and discuss it, see whether you think there's merit to it. When you have what the chair feels is the will of the board in your hand, a good feeling for what the board wants to say, you call for a motion on that item, and then do findings of fact and conclusions of law on that item.
Madam Chair, I suspect that Mr. Collier did not mean to confine us to talk about one item at a time without an ability to discuss the relationships that they have to each other and overriding concerns that affect more than one of them.
Sure, you discuss everything holus bolus, as it were, all
Yeah,
together
right.
first, and then get into each one.
Fine, thank you.
And James, as a point of order, am I required to read each of the appeals, or can I summarize it as they've been summarized in the presentation?
Now, you guys have been reading for months. I think that when you just open the floor for discussion, let everybody vent a little bit and get their feelings out as to what's going on with the appeal. As the member said, you might want to go back and forth between this issue vis-a-vis that issue, and then eventually steer them towards, all right, let's go through the first item, which is, and just say what it is. Everybody knows what they are. You all have them in front of you. You've all been reading and thinking about them for ages.
Okay, great. I actually, in doing my homework, I took each one, and but I think that's a perhaps a better way to start. Just get a feeling from members of the board. Anybody want to kick it off? And again, I'm going to ask members who are listening in online. You should be muted. If there is, this is only for members of the Board of Appeals. So, Anybody want to kick us off? Mike, you look like you want to kick us off.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Be brave, Mike, be brave.
No, be foolish, Mike, be foolish. Oh, boy. Okay, I will. I believe that the concerns that CTR has raised in several cases have real validity. And I think in my mind, the hinge concern is actually their first one, which was that the planning board failed to consider AWL's entire proposal as a single project. And I've spent way too much time on this, but I don't know how you separate the two projects and pretend that they're not one thing. There are just so many points of intersection and I apologize if I'm using the CTR shorthand, but AWL1 and AWL2 work for me. That they are one thing. There are properties that are coterminous. There are so many changes that took place that integrate the two. You know, not just potentially legally, but certainly physically. You know, the closing off of the Kellytown Road access to AWL1. You know, the only entrance is through AWL2. The restructuring of their first proposal into the second, I just think, in my mind, it may be the same property, it may be the same idea, but it is very much a very different proposal that AWL came back to in, I guess it was September. AWL 2B, for lack of a better one, that makes me believe this is one project and it needs to be looked at as one project.
I'd agree with Mike. In my opinion, I agree with the CIT first statement. The project has the same access, the same administration building, same recreation building, the same ownership. In my mind, it's one unit and should be considered as one project. And to not do so is an error. So I'd agree with Mike, and I agree with the CIT petition on number 1.
I agree.
Thank you, Mel.
I could,
Marcia?
I agree.
Okay,
Both men.
all right, Rick?
I was ready to address the same problem along with the new application versus continuing application question. And they're difficult issues, and I struggled with them to the extent that I actually wrote out something to say about it. So I don't know that I'm going to say anything that's going to surprise anybody, but be patient. It may take a few minutes, but I think it may be useful. There are two complex and interrelated issues that affect virtually every decision we have to make in this case. One is whether the September 14th, 2021 lodge filing was a new application or just a modification of the original January 2021 lodge application. That will determine whether the May ordinance amendments apply. Second is whether the evidence which was presented on the September version sufficiently supported the planning board's conclusion that it met the ordinance's requirements. The answers to those difficult questions have important and perhaps dispositive effects on all of our decisions. The January 2021 lodge application was for 154 units of various kinds, using all of a 42-acre parcel for a traditional campground. It proposed 72 RVs, 40 tent platforms, 42 cabins. There were gang bathrooms and showers. There were no refrigerators, counters, sinks, or cupboards in individual sites, other than what the RVs themselves may have carried. Presumably, there were locations for campfires or fire pits. The September version is very different. There were only 55 units and no RV sites. There were luxury tents and yurts with refrigerators, counters, sinks, and cupboards, and smokeless fire pits suitable for grilling food that was available for sale to renters pre-prepared at an on-site store. Only about half the acres, the 42 acres, were devoted to the project. The road pattern was different. The water supply, water quality, and sewage disposable needs were different, perhaps less, perhaps greater, but surely different. They were different at the very least because the individual bathrooms, individual showers, the kitchen sinks, the fitness center, the pool, the cafe, the food store, and the spa, and the new employee housing. For sure, these differences had some effect. The nature and extent of their impact on the project was impossible to measure without further investigation. At first short glance, the September application seems to be just a smaller version of the original, made smaller in response to local objections, and thus should not require new evaluations by the applicant's expert witnesses. However, it was no longer a traditional campground. It was now a glamp ground, a comfortable retreat for people who would spend $400 to $500 a night for lodgings in the woods that would provide them with amenities that they had come to expect at resort hotels. That's not a condemnation of campgrounds or a criticism of them. It's just a statement that they're different. If that were the end of the story, I would really not be sure if the September version was a continuation of the January one or should be treated as a new application, or that it made a great deal of difference since the May amendments seemed to make only modest demands on the design of the project, and the rest of it could easily have been met by the applicants if we had ordered a limited remand to the planning board. There are significant additional facts, though, which I think have to determine for us not only the issue of which ordinance provisions apply, but also the issue of whether the applicant's evidence for the 55-unit lodge supported the approval granted by the planning board. When the January 21 application was made, the planning board had already approved, and the Board of Appeals had affirmed, both in 2019, a separate application to build 11 cabins of 231 square feet each on an adjoining 1.6 acre lot owned by the same applicants. That was Acadia Wilderness Village. The applicants have treated that as a separate entity, and as far as I know, did not even refer to it in their January application. After all, the village had already been reviewed and approved by the planning board and by the Board of Appeals. That was true, but it was not the whole truth, because the village project had significantly changed since its approval. In mid-2020, without any action by the planning board, the CEO modified the approved plans to permit 5 yurts of 452 square feet each and 6 yurts of 707 square feet each instead of the 11 smaller cabins. That increased the guest living space from 2,541 square feet to 6,502 square feet, about 2.5 times as much. Then in July 2021, the CEO modified the plan again, this time to change one of the smaller yurts to the 707 size and to remove the planned administrative building. So now the guest living space was 6,757 feet, which is 2.66 times the original 2,541. The parties to our case disagree whether the two modifications of the village plan by the CEO were within his authority to approve. That is a matter that is not now before us. It's in the Superior Court, and it's not within our authority to decide anything regarding the propriety of those changes. But on the other hand, we are not free to pretend the changes weren't made and didn't become the pattern for the current construction of the original 11 units. There are two serious concerns. One of them is that the evidence brought to the planning board in 2019 to satisfy ordinance standards regarding the village may or may not accurately evaluate current conditions there. 2.66 times the enclosed living area means a substantial greater impervious roof area, meaning that stormwater runoff is greater. How much greater? I have no idea. It means perhaps 2.66 times the number of guests, using 2.66 times as much water, doing 2.66 times as much campfire grilling, and disposing of 2.66 times as much sewage. Would the planning board have made the same disposition of this version of the village as the one it made in 2019? I don't know. Would it have done so with the same conditions that imposed or lack of them? I don't know that either. What I do know is that Acadia Wilderness Lodge and Acadia Wilderness Village were no longer separate projects in September 2021, but rather had become one unified development when the July 29 modification incorporated July 29, 2021 modification incorporated the updated village plan into the lodge. And that was before the September 2021 filing of the second lodge application or modification, whatever, with the planning board. Administration of the project is common and unitary and takes place only on lodge property. Access to village units is only through lodge roads. Village guests will have the same amenities and privileges as lodge guests, and the amenities are all on the lodge areas. The 11 village units are not a negligible or trivial add-on to the project. They constitute an additional 20% added to the lodge, treating the lodge and the village as two independent entities without each affecting the design and performance of the other ignores reality. So what I also know now is that the total 66 unit project in its current form has never been accurately tested to see if it meets ordinance standards. The village itself no longer is what it was, and the combined impact of the whole project as it now exists and it has never been evaluated. And so the bottom line, which has taken me a long time to get to, and I apologize for that, is that the evidence before the planning board was insufficient in most particulars, not all, to prove that the total project would satisfy ordinance standards. It would not have been sufficient unless it had enabled the planning board to evaluate the conditions presented by the entire project as they now are projected. Whose fault is that? Doesn't matter. Should the applicants have been more forthcoming in presenting their evidence? Probably. Should the planning board have been more inquisitive? Maybe, after the objectors called this to their attention on October 7th. As I said, it just doesn't matter, but it remains an unsolved significant problem, one that in my view requires us to reverse the actions of the planning board. If the board decides that the September Lodge application was a new one, the May ordinance amendments apply. If the board decides that the evidence before the planning board was insufficient because it did not take into account the joinder of the lodge and the village, the changes in the village from what was approved in 2019, and the total impact of the combined project, then the evidence could not have been reasonably relied on by the planning board to prove the requirements of our site plan ordinance and our land use ordinance were made. Thank you. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Rick. I similarly feel as the other board members do. I'm going to put much more simply and less eloquently than Rick did. But I was really trying to keep these two projects separate, the village and the lodge. I was really trying to go there. But for me, when I asked whether or not the entrance to the village had to go through the lodge, and the answer was yes. I don't see, therefore, they being integrated just in that one area, never mind all the other areas. I don't see how you could look at this application honestly, realistically, without looking at the bigger picture, because they were not integrated when we looked at the village initially. Now they are. There's, without question, just the road aspect and the fact that they have access to the amenities and et cetera, and the one check-in and all of that. I just don't see how you can keep them separate. I really tried hard. I really tried to put my feet in those shoes, and I could not get there. And I read both sides over and over, and I could not get there, because just common sense. If you have one entrance to the village and to the lodge, it's an integrated project. So for me, that kind of was the determiner. James.
Okay, so I think you've heard from all your board members. Why don't you just go ahead and get a motion on this? And then once we have the motion second, ask for discussion, if God knows if we need any more, and then do a few findings, just like on what you just said, Chair Harris. You just mentioned a number of items you could say, if that's the way you want to go. And here are the following examples of the not being togetherness. And then you move on to the next one.
I think we have another member, don't we?
Oh, sorry.
I said, I think we have another member. Have we heard from Marcia?
Yes.
Sorry
Marcia,
for
you
that,
wanna-
Marcia.
I'm here. I'm here.
did you want to add anything to your agreement to?
What Joanne said, I agree with what has been said. Joanne, was very succinct, and I agree with it. I'm a little confused. I think I might have come in late to this. Maybe I was sick when you guys started this out. But is the yurt thing the village?
Yes. No, the original 11.
The original 11 yurts are the village.
Yes.
Okay. And so the other part is the campground? What is the other part called?
Lodge is the various is the campground. Yes.
Campground. Okay. And so are we saying that in order to get to the campground, does this say, in order to get to the campground, you have to go through the village?
Other way around. In order to get to the village, you have to enter the campground.
And that would be from 102.
Yes.
Okay. I just have
And
to,
initially, as I recall, initially the village had an access to it from the Kellytown Road.
right,
And and I think that gets closed off, according to this application.
okay, but it's there now. The yurts are there now, right?
I haven't been there. I don't know.
Well, I've ridden down the Kellytown Road and there's something that looks like a bunch of yurts on the left.
Okay.
I don't know if they're all finished, but yes, you are correct. The yurts are there on the,
Okay.
off the Kellytown Road.
But the campground, nothing's been done about that yet, right?
Correct.
Not,
There's
Okay.
no road or anything in the campground. There's just that house on the 102 that's gonna be the check-in or something.
is that right, Jesse? That nothing has been started there?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. I agree with Joey and the other guy.
Okay. All right. So James, let me, somebody call me?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
did.
yes, Rick. Yeah.
Can I ask Mr. Collier a couple of questions? For our guidance? Jim, should we make the motion, which apparently we're going to make, tentative so we don't get into that 7-day thing on the drawing the written decision?
The way you usually do it is you just go ahead and do, in this case, however many issues there are, take a vote on each one. And then when you do a vote on the overall motion, then you have a vote on that. And then when you're finished, just before you go to adjourn,
Yeah.
here we'll say something like, this is all tentative until we subject to the findings of fact and conclusions will all being written up, and everybody
Okay.
agrees to that, and then you move on.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I
Yes, go ahead, Mike.
I also have a question. What is the best way to phrase a motion? And I would ask this of our attorney. Do we simply say, I move to accept the objection of concerned Tremont residents, point A, or do we read the whole thing out, or what do we do?
You could do whatever you want. Sorry, Madam Chair, if I may.
Please.
I've seen it done a dozen different ways. And there's no exact right way to do it. So for example, I'll give you a few examples and you pick one. You could say, I move to uphold the appeal in that the planning board failed to consider AWL's entire proposal for the AWL2 project in synchronicity, and something like that. And then you could have a second and a discussion. Or you could say what I think you said, Mike, originally. You could just make a short statement. I move that the two projects should have been considered together. And then you could discuss that and then later on, you could vote to approve or deny the appeal and then use that as one of the reasons. So it depends on which way you want to do it. I obviously, being a lawyer, like the first way, that you address what the appellant said, respond to it specifically, make a positive motion on it, get a second, have discussion, get a vote, then immediately do the findings of fact and conclusions of law. So what I would propose is, assuming this motion is going to be approved, you make that motion, the first one I suggested. Then you do findings of fact, very simple, about what the thing was, where it was, a few findings if you need to in regard to things that show the synchronicity of the two sites. Then you get into the stuff that Joanne said. I mean, God, if we could have just taped what she said and repeated it, make a few conclusions of law like that, move on to number 2.
Through the chair, point of order, where Attorney Collier does the standard of appellate review come in? Because the board is actually conducting this as a de novo, not as a purely appellate review.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Go ahead, James.
Obviously, that's not true. So in the standard of review, it's very simple, which I don't know if it was Andy or Amy, but somebody went through that before, right at the start. So it's either a mistake in the law or a inadequate evidence on a particular matter. And it's a really high standard. It's almost no evidence whatsoever that a reasonable person could use to find otherwise. So that's the standard of review, and it's appellate in this case, not de novo.
Okay. Yes, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, I don't know if this meets our attorney's goal, but I would suggest that I make a motion that the appeal of point A of the CTR, that the planning board failed to consider AWL's entire proposal for the AWL2 project, is affirmed and remanded to the planning board for review as a single project.
I'll second.
Okay.
May I raise a question about that?
Yes,
And
Rick.
If we disapprove of what the planning board did, that does not automatically remand it to the planning board, as I understand it. That's the end of it.
All right, I
As
would,
far as we're concerned.
I would modify my motion to remove the statement of remand to the planning board.
Before you do that, let's ask Mr. Collier agrees. Was I right about that?
thumbs up.
Okay.
Yeah, you only want to remand if there's something to remand for. So in this case, I think I was going to interrupt earlier, but you get in before I did. I was going to interrupt Mike and say, you want to do each of the items, and then when you're finished, decide to remand and how. For example, in this case, and the reason you would do all of them, like somebody, I think it might have been chair mentioned there's 7 or 8. You want to go through all of them and decide whichever you're going to decide on. So here, I think the gist of the motion is that the board made an error in that it did not consider both of them together, so it didn't have the proper facts in front of it and so on. So then you decide on each of them. Now, if this is the only one that you agree on, so we'll isolate this, for example, then what you would do is later on at the end, you might say that you want to remand. And the reason you would remand in this case is if you think it's recoverable or fixable. So for example, if you think this is something that the planning board could do better, or do it all, I guess is what you're saying, then you could remand and let them do it. But I see that as a separate issue. So to be in short, my suggestion would be take out the remand part, Mike, do all of the items, then discuss, approve, deny, affirm, remand later on at the end.
All right,
I'll withdraw my prior second and wait for Mike to make a new motion.
Thank you, Mike.
okay, I'll try this again, and I'll try to get it right this time. I move that the appeals board accept the objection of CTR that the planning board failed to consider AWL's entire proposal for the AWL2 project.
And I will second that.
Thank you. Any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor of the motion. I'm going to do a roll call vote on this, if that's appropriate.
That's
All
good.
right, James. Mel,
Aye.
Rick,
Yes.
Yes.
Marcia,
Yes, I agree.
Mike,
Yes,
and I agree. So that is 5-0, that we are in agreement on Mike's motion. I'm now going to take,
Madam Chair,
yes,
so here, I think it would be customary, to keep things simple, to do findings of fact and conclusions of law on this particular item is simple. We can do the findings, the general findings of fact now, or we can do them later. And you don't need that many individual findings. The general ones would be about the basic facts, the name of the applicant, their relationship to the property, location of the property, description of the project, key elements in the proposal, and so on. The specific ones for this matter might be something very specific, like the board finds that the planning board looked at the entire application, but that it did not look at the two sites synchronistically. Then in the conclusion of law, the failure to look at both sites together as one campground led to, and then you fill in the things that you mentioned earlier, Joanne. This wasn't recognized, looked at, this wasn't looked at, and this wasn't looked at. So that's how you do the findings of fact and conclusions of law. The findings and conclusions or vice versa.
and James, we would do that now. I was
I
thinking
think
we
it's
need
easy,
to
always easier to do the measure. It's fresh in your mind. You've done this matter, you know, you just talked about it.
right. But A is not actually a standalone. It has A1 and A2.
Oh, I don't think she did all that. Those are just different reasons for how she's arguing about it. I mean,
Okay, so we can, okay,
you made your motion in general. I've heard Mike's motion. You could mention those items, you know, as some of the reasons in your conclusions of law, but I don't think you have to address each one. Good.
all right, so we should discuss the findings of fact at this point?
I think so. I mean,
Okay.
I could propose some for you real quickly.
Is
I
there-
have no objection to that.
With this paperwork stuff, can't we reserve this for reviewing the document you're going to prepare?
Yeah, we can do it that way. And what I would say about that is this. That is, some boards have success with that. What you would do is have a little discussion about it now. I'll just run through a few, see if anybody agrees, see if anybody else wants to take anything, add anything to it. And then I would take it away with the minutes, draft up something, and then have you discuss it later.
Would it be possible on Mike's motion to find the fact, if everybody agrees, that we individually mentioned on the record? I mean,
It
I
would
went
be-
on at great length about it.
It would be if you had verbatim minutes. I don't know if you have verbatim minutes.
I just have a question. Rick, my assumption is you're reading from a prepared document?
Which I could email to everybody.
Oh, no, yeah, that'd be fine, but I'm not using something that long.
Well,
Could you summarize it?
Typewriter tape is a week?
My findings are bullet point, a lot shorter and to the point.
Okay.
I'm not a judge. I don't write like a judge.
Madam Chair, just a quick objection for the record. Member Cohen has pre-prepared a decision document that is wholly inappropriate under Maine law. Generally, my concern is the board is doing a de novo review and is not conducting a fair, purely appellate review, which considers clearly contrary and substantial evidence standards. If the board persists, I would just like my general objection to these proceedings noted. I think the board is way off the rails.
May I
Thank you, Mr.
respond to that? What I prepared was notes so that I could remember what I wanted to say. on the conclusions that I had personally reached about a couple of major issues that were before us. I don't know what a decision document means under Maine law, but if it's more than a forum member's aide memoir, I'm quite sure this isn't one of them.
So, Madam Chair.
And there is nothing
Oh,
in what I said that was off the reservation in terms of the record before the planning board.
Yes, James.
So, well, as I was saying, Andy's got his objection in, it's noted, and he can take that up on a further appeal if he wants to. If you'd like, then I would go to the findings of fact if you have verbatim minutes or a really good secretary. So who does your minutes and how good are they?
I think Jesse has been,
They're not
Thanks.
verbatim.
okay.
All right,
Because
I have made some notes and I could read them in as what I find the reasons for the finding and see if those are acceptable to
Sure.
other members of the appeals board.
Great.
I will start first. The two properties are contiguous. Access to one property is only available via an internal road connection.
can I interrupt you right there, Mike?
Yes,
Sorry, I'm sorry, but the first thing to do before you get into that, well, I think you want to get to cover the basics first,
I thought
such
that
as
was.
the applicant's name is.
Oh.
They own the property. They also own the property next door. The location of the property is such and such Tremont Road. The project was for a campground of X number of units. Then you can say what you want to say.
So James, can we ask you to insert that, all of those particulars? And
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And all of that should be
Sure,
included.
Mike.
That would be great. And
I'll
then
get all
we
those
get
in.
to, yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. First, the two properties are contiguous. Access to one of the properties is only available via an internal road connection. Check-in at both properties are the same. Facilities available to both properties are identical and all are based on AWL B, 2B, and are not available to the general public. That was a statement. Ownership of both properties is the same. And operations, including marketing, reservations, management, and maintenance are identical.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I wonder if Mike would add to that the fact that the village property, as it is now proposed, is significantly different in ways that we really can't measure from
I
what
would-
was approved in 2019.
I would agree to that addition.
See, the trouble with this, Madam Chair, is you're going down a road that, and I don't want Andy to talk again as much as I like the fellow, but you're going down the road that he's talking about, okay? So I know what Mike's getting at, which is here's some examples of what was in the record. But I don't think discussion of this was this or this was that is relevant. Because if you say, we as a board find that there was X, Y, or Z, you're doing a de novo review. What you should be saying is, from the record, it was clear that the board considered the following matters. And then your conclusion of law would be the board was in error because it did not consider the two of them together. But I don't think you want to get into a findings about individual matters. That's for the planning board. You see the distinction, or am I being inartful again?
No, you're making sense.
Yeah.
Really? Wow, that's exciting. I never make sense.
Write that one down.
But you were worried about minutes. There's a recording being made of this. Can't you get everything that people said and use the extent to the extent that it's
You are naive. We're in a small town, Maine. So the way it works is, for example, in Mount Desert, there's a nice woman named Heidi Smallage, and she writes almost everything verbatim. And certainly motions, she makes people repeat them different times. To do what you're saying would mean that at my exorbitant fee, that I sit and listen to this entire hearing again and pick out. That's time consuming and expensive. I mean, if that's the way the town wants to spend its money.
As well as cruel and unusual punishment.
I wasn't gonna go there, but
You can.
that would
Okay,
take.
so I'd like to pick up on your point, James, that getting into the, whatever changes may have occurred to Acadia Wilderness Village is not on the table.
Right,
that-
that's the de novo, that's a de novo
Right.
that Andy's whining about. What you want to get in here, I should say Andy makes a wonderful point about however he wants to put it. You want to stick to an appellate review.
Correct.
So
And
there's evidence
in
the
the,
record.
and in the appeal, with maps and everything, it is clear, that's why I focused on the road, because that was the one that tipped it for me. The road brings in Acadia Wilderness Village, whether they meant to or not. And therefore, not taking Acadia Wilderness Village, those 11 sites, into account, I think was an omission, an
Well,
oversight.
Why don't we do it that way, Madam Chair? Why don't we do it exactly that way? Let me propose something in
Go ahead.
regard to the road. So I would say, start out your first finding of fact with something like, there is evidence in the record that the board considered the road in this way. Then I would move on and say, there was evidence in the record that the board did this in regard to some other aspect of the application. Once you get a few of those in, like Mike started to say, and you said earlier, then I would say, there is no evidence in the record, or very limited evidence, that the board considered both campgrounds together. Therefore, we conclude that, see how I'm going there? I'm trying to avoid you finding specific facts in evidence. That's a de novo review.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I think we have a motion on the table that Mike made and a second by Mel. I don't know if anybody can read that back. Jesse, do you by any chance have that?
Mike said that he made a motion to uphold the point A of the appeal, as there was no evidence that they considered AWL's entire proposal for the two facilities.
Okay, and we had a 5-0 vote. And findings of fact, I'll just lay out some, and James, you steer me if I go off base.
I'm ready.
We were presented with information during the appeal that the road into Acadia Wilderness Lodge was the only road that could be taken to get to Acadia Wilderness Village. Consequently, these two properties are integrated, and we find
No, Madam Chair, no. You don't want to do that. You're doing the job of the planning board.
All right, then we find that that the planning board did not take into consideration Acadia Wilderness Village appropriately in terms of its review of this application.
Right. You could give examples, but you don't want to make a conclusion of find anything about them specifically, such as they should have done this with the two roads together. That's a finding of fact. You don't find a fact in that way. You don't find a specific thing to be factual. You talk
Okay.
about the evidence that was in the record, which leads to your conclusion. So there was evidence in the record that the campers were likely to cross across the lines from one site to another. That'd be fine.
Okay,
Yes.
I had several other points. I don't know if you want them in there, but I can go
Yes.
slowly so Jesse can capture them in here. Number one, the two properties are contiguous. Second, the two properties are only accessible via a shared internal road connection. Check-in at both properties is the same. Facilities available to both properties are identical and all are located on AWL2 and are not available to the general public. Ownership of both properties are the same, and that operationally, from a marketing, reservations, management, and maintenance standpoint, they are the same.
So I think what you meant to say, and I'm trying to help you say it, Mike, is that there was evidence in the record to that effect.
Yes, there was.
All right, good. You're not making findings that those things existed. But there was,
That's what the record said.
the
That's what they
record showed that.
Yes.
Okay, I can go with that.
Okay.
Now, there was no evidence in the record, or very little, exceedingly little. Stop me if this isn't true. That the board took those things and did a review of the two things together. You see what I'm driving at?
Yes. There was, in my opinion, not only was there no evidence, but there was concentrated evidence to keep the two separate.
Right.
There was evidence that the road pattern was evaluated as a total. Evidence before the planning board. Whoever did the road stuff talked about what effect the addition of the village would have on the Lodge Road.
Yeah, and that's important to point out because the standard that you're looking at here is that there was, you're trying to say, boy, there's no way that anybody could have concluded that the two of them were looked at together and thoroughly analyzed. There was a mistake made here. No reasonable person would have failed to see that the two of them weren't looked at together. The thing that the judge mentions is a good point because it's one instance. And what the other side might say is, well, that's enough. That's the evidence that they were looked at together. See the type of just what I'm driving at there? It has to be overwhelming evidence if you're doing it on a factual basis. And no reasonable person would have done it otherwise, based on the evidence and stuff that was in the record that Mike mentioned. Did I lose you again?
Oh, what's the next step?
The next step is to move on.
Okay.
Number two.
Okay. Okay.
Have we voted?
Yeah,
Well,
we
we
did.
voted on A. It was it was unanimous, 5-0, to uphold CTR's appeal that the planning board failed to consider AWL's entire proposal for the AWL2 project. And we just went through some of the reasons why we believe that to be the case, based on the evidence.
So, Madam Chair, on the second one, this is mostly 90% a legal matter. So maybe I should comment on the second one first.
Are you talking about A2 or are you talking about B?
B, we're done with A.
Okay,
Thank
good.
God.
Okay,
So B is the planning board improperly delegated to AWL the authority to manipulate the northern boundary. So I read through that and I read through what was in the record. I don't know that they ever promised to do so. What they said was approximately X number of acres would be undeveloped for 5 years. And then after that, there was some suggestion they might build a house there or do some other permitted uses. And then there was a whole argument by Ms. Chow about whether they had to get it on a plan or whatever. The answer is very simply that I've done this for a couple decades. It's Mr. Hamilton and Ms. Chow for longer than that. It's very clear that any planning board can delegate a lot of stuff to a code enforcement officer as long as it comes back to them for the final approval and there's an element in there. So you had to go no farther than my good friend Diane O'Connell. She was very specific about this. They do some plan and show 20 acres somewheres. And code enforcement officer goes, thank you, I'll receive that. Their job, the code enforcement officer, is ministerial. They make no decisions. They just receive it. And then it goes to the planning board. So I guess the only thing you could do is if it wasn't the approximately 20 acres, the planning board might tell the code enforcement officer not give them certificate of occupancy, but that's all you can do. They've delegated. So what's the condition? Approximately 20 acres is shown on a plan. That's all they got to do. That's it. A, legally, you can do it. People do it all the time. B, it doesn't have to be exact. And C, the code enforcement officer is not deciding anything. They're just a functionary taking in the document.
And there's no role for the planning
Madam
board.
Chair, I
After
have a
that.
question.
Go ahead,
Madam
Mel.
Chair, I have a question.
Go ahead. Mel,
I have a what? My record has the next item to be discussed was the access through the campground, failure to provide adequate emergency access through AWN campground to a public road. It had nothing to do with delegation, as Mr. Collier mentioned.
Yeah, but that's only part of the larger issue that they didn't consider the two of them together.
Okay,
Right, the
so
larger.
there'll be no
I'm
vote
with
on
you.
that.
well,
We
I
already
was
did.
with you, Mel. They took it as a whole rather than breaking it into the two parts.
Okay,
Yeah,
Okay,
I will yield to the town's attorney on this, but I've got to tell you, I find it pretty remarkable that in the material presented to the planning board and then that we reviewed earlier, they knew to the 100th of an acre exactly how much was devoted to the campground. It was, if I can read this properly, it was 18.29 acres. Well, that's awfully precise. I mean, that's incredibly precise in terms of what has been allocated for the campground. So clearly, AWL must have known where that line was that separated the undeveloped portion that they reserved for future development and the portion that they allocated to the campground. So, the notion that you can't tell us where that line is and all it is this large, vague, squiggly line on the plan just seems to me ridiculous. I mean, if you look at the difference between 18.29 acres and 18.3 acres, which they could have certainly rounded it up to, it works out to a grand total of 435 square feet. I mean, that's pretty precise when you're looking at a 47 acres, something like that, 796,000 square feet, and they can get it to that close. I mean, this constant kind of evasion of where's the line, it disturbs me. But you've said that's not a matter for us, and I'll accept it. But I just find it odd that they can get down to 1/100th of an acre and not know where the line is.
The question is, what was the condition? What was the purpose of the condition? Can they grant conditions? And how was it done? The condition was that on a plan, some area that was approximately 20 acres would be shown. You know what that's like saying? That's like saying a brown dog will be handed over to Bobby on Z Street on Tuesday. And you coming along and saying, it's not a brown dog, it's a beige dog. I mean, it's approximately 20 acres. As long as approximately 20 acres is shown on some plan that they're gonna stick to, it's fine. What's the purpose of the condition? It's simple. So that at some point in the future, the code enforcement officer can go out and say, whoa, you've developed over the line. The applicant promised they'd have approximately 20 acres. So how do you do that when you have a flag? Now, the reason you do this is because not every application you may not think so, Mike, but you'd be there every day for years trying to figure out every particular item and get it nailed down. So you let some of them happen later.
I accept.
And then
Yeah,
you.
My understanding of this part of the appeal, which is the planning board improperly delegated to AWL the authority to manipulate the northerly boundary of the AWL2 campground after the approval. Bottom line is, it's part of the condition of the approval that the planning board said that it's a condition. If you want this approval, you have to mark those acres at some point. And I believe that's legal. Whether we like it or not is irrelevant.
That's my advice to you anyways. You may disagree with me, but my advice to you is this is garden variety conditions. Perfectly.
And so I didn't find a problem with the application on this particular point.
I think it's apparent, isn't it, that the reason it was handled this way was to accommodate a concern that the applicants had as to whether or not they were going to have to undergo SLOTA proceedings. Flexibility, I guess, is not a bad idea. If you can go to SLOTA and say, I got 24 point something acres in that northern part that we're not using, and only 18.29 that we're using for the campground itself. That seems to be a number that was arrived at for a purpose, because it really doesn't reflect what's going on, I don't think. But I'm not sure that this is a dispositive issue at all. I think we have other bigger fish to fry.
Yeah, I think we have to stick to our job is to find out whether the planning board did this in error. And I don't find that they did.
And one thing you could do, Madam Chair, for future reference is to Mike's point. If you decided that this was okay, and if you were going to approve the whole thing, one of the things, but the thing was just slightly screwed up and you're worried about what Mike's saying, what you might have been able to do is to say that you condition your approval on the line being straightforward and easy for the code enforcement officer to understand. Maybe a straight line across the back or some straight lines that were all flagged out. So you might do something like that if you had to. But here, where I think you're going to approve the appeal, I don't know if you want to go there. I mean, you could if you wanted to. So you have limited ability, but you have a small ability to place conditions on something.
Should a motion be made, then we can have it in play, and then the appeals board can vote it up or down? I think that would.
Yeah, good idea.
Would make some sense. Okay, then I'll do this again. I move that based on the facts presented, that AWL can and should be required to denote the exact location of the boundary line between the campground and the reserve portion of the lot.
I'll second.
Well,
You've already promised to do that.
That's part of the condition, I believe, of
Yeah,
approval.
you promised to do that. I'm not for or against your motion, Mike, but I kind of think it's out of order because they already promised to do it.
correct.
The findings of fact, which hopefully you guys had by the planning board. Yeah,
I only put it in place so we could vote it up or down. I think
Okay.
we need to decide on every one of these, don't we?
we do.
Or can we just say it's not something we can act on? I don't even care about that, but I do care that we address each one of them and we make a decision.
Yeah,
How about,
I think the
Madam Chair,
better
how
way
about a
is,
motion that says that the planning board did not make an error in permitting the applicant to stay loose on the northern boundary line for the present, or something.
great.
I will withdraw my motion if Mel will withdraw his second, and then Rick can make that motion.
I'll withdraw my second.
Thank you, Mel.
And I withdraw my motion.
I'd like to propose this one, if you don't mind, Rick.
Go ahead.
I move that since the second condition of approval that the planning board made had to do with delineating the 20 acres of land that came before us through evidence, that this part of the appeal it cannot be upheld.
Second.
James, does that work for you?
hey, I'm just here to get along.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So that motion has been put forward and seconded. Basically, what we're saying here, and this is the discussion part, is that it's legal for the planning board to make that a condition of approval, which they did, and it's in there, right there, number 2. So, and our attorney is telling us it's legal to do that. So I don't think that B has merit, and that's essentially what the motion says. Any other discussion on that one? Okay, I'm going to call for a roll call vote then. Mel,
Aye, yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Mike,
No,
Marcia,
Yes.
and I say yes. So that is 4-1, that particular appeal is not upheld.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Rick.
Yeah, may I give everybody some good news? One thing we can all agree on today. NBC News just told my phone that the Russian warship, the Moskva, that was the biggest cruiser the Russians had in the Black Sea, has sunk.
Yes.
And that's
Yes,
one
thank
thing
you.
to smile about tonight.
Yes. Although I hope everybody got off, and I think they did. So,
Yeah, they
yes, it
did.
has some-
They did.
Yes, good. All right, James, can we move on to C now?
Yeah, if I can get a comment on that one too. I don't want to be too forward or fresh.
Yes, sure.
This one is a red herring. I mean, there's no there.
What are we
I
talking-
would say that this is irrelevant. Light, heavy, up, down, sideways, who cares? The question is, I think Mr. Hamilton was spot on in his analysis, which is that when there's a specific standard in the ordinance, that's what you go by. So the discussion of light or heavy, that's in the the more general parts of the ordinance. This zone is intended to do this and have light commercial in it. That's not a standard you're reviewing. The law is clear. The law is crystal black letter law. When you have a more specific standard, and I'll tell you the standard. The standard is our campgrounds an allowable use in the zone? The answer is yes. What are the standards for campgrounds? There's a whole bunch of them. The board went through them. So the board did not, in my opinion, as a legal matter, have to make any finding or light or heavy. God bless them, because it's impossible to do. So,
Madam Chair,
sure.
Yes, Rick.
everything that Mr. Collier just said is true, but it's not what the objection is that Ms. Chow raised. Clearly, he's right that light commercial in that it was aspirational when it was describing
Yeah, aspirational, good
what
word.
we're going to do in this zone. But as I understood the further argument that was being made, it's a question of locating buffers for the farmhouse under a provision which appears on my page 32 out of 87 of the 2020 ordinance. It's a paragraph 3, which says, among other things, in addition, buffers are required within the front property lines of heavy commercial, heavy industrial, and multi-use, and multifamily uses. So the argument, as I understood it, was that we are now changing the farmhouse into part of a heavy commercial, not a light commercial use, and therefore you've got to require those buffers. And as a matter of law, the planning board made an error in ignoring that provision.
And Rick, what do you base it as heavy commercial at that point?
Unfortunately, our ordinance doesn't seem to be concerned with the definition. I'm not saying that I agree this is heavy commercial or I disagree. I'm not saying one way or the other. All I'm saying is that what Mr. Collier says was absolutely accurate, but what Ms. Chow was saying was something different.
I disagree completely. What the judge, what you do is you go from the standard, which is the specific one, that is campground. And then when it comes to buffering, it's part of a campground. Therefore, the buffering standard is the one for campgrounds. So it's just what my point, and I will be quiet after this, but I will say that it is irrelevant because it's a campground. Therefore, the buffering is that which you must do for a campground. It's a specific standard related to campgrounds. Therefore, that's the specific standard. So just follow the logic along. It's a specific use that's allowable. Therefore, you don't decide heavy or light. And it's a specific buffering standard. And therefore, you don't go for a general standard. You go for a specific over the general. That, in my opinion, Madam Chair, is black letter law.
Okay.
I have a question for the attorney, and he can absolutely tell me that this is an inappropriate forum. I was just curious if what I hear you saying is that the word light commercial is meaningless without a set of standards or definitions of what constitutes light commercial versus heavy commercial, that the land use ordinance, if it wants to enforce it, needs to say, and this is how you can look at a commercial use and determine whether it is light or it is heavy. Is that?
No.
And I'm not saying it's in the ordinance. I'm saying that if you defined, measurable, quantifiable attributes, then you could look at it and say, oh, you generate 12 cubic yards of solid waste a day. That does not fit the definition of light commercial.
So I
That's
think you're
heavy commercial.
right. You're right in part, Mike, and not right in part. So that's how you would do it. And there's a memo that I drafted for the planning board, which says all that. But that's not what you would do here. What you would do is you would put a standard in there which would say something like this. Every time you look at a campground, you must decide whether that campground is a type of campground that's light commercial or heavy commercial. Then you might say, for example, campgrounds that have no more than 5 campsites spread out on with a density of X, we consider light commercial. If there's more than X number of tent sites, RV sites, yurt sites, when a density of ratio of more than X, we consider those heavy. You see what I mean? So not only in doing what you're saying, in which you are correct, that's how you would do it. But you would also need to put a standard in there saying that you need to do it. All that's in here is an aspirational discussion about what's allowed in the zone.
Okay.
So it's like saying, in this zone, we allow things that are pretty, like campgrounds and some other stuff.
Puppies.
Yeah, to define that it's pretty, no, but it says we need pretty stuff such as campgrounds.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So my reading of this was there is no, as we've just been discussing, there is no further definition for us to use. There's no guideposts for us to compare what we're looking at with what they consider light or heavy. It's just, it's not there. And their own, the planning board's own counsel told them it was not necessary to review that particular question, heavy versus light, because it's vague. It's way too vague. If you read the footnote, one of the planning board members says, who writes this stuff? And another planning board member said, well, not me. I mean, it is too vague, and perhaps in a future ordinance, we'll get more specific. But right now, we can't invent that. We may have feelings about it, but we can't rule on our feelings. So I guess I found on this one, again, that the appellant did not, I couldn't find for the appellant in this case, because there's no, the planning board did not err, because there's nothing to err on, essentially. Not a great story, but that's all we have to work with. That's what I came up with.
I propose a motion for you if you'd like.
Sure.
The planning board did not err in failing to find whether the AWL 2B proposal was light or heavy commercial, in that the standard is not applicable.
I like that. I'll take those words and put it out there as a motion.
Second.
Thank you, Rick. I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on this one? I think the ordinance needs work, I'll tell you that, but any further
I
discussion?
disagree on this one, Madam Chair, because it doesn't need to be defined. I went through this with the planning board. I argued with the chair and other members about defining light versus heavy. And the answer is, why bother? You've got a specific standard, which is campground.
Shouldn't we remove it from the land use ordinance then?
It's not in there. It's just a discussion about the type of uses that you'd like to have.
I don't think words in the land use ordinance just appeared magically. I think somebody put them in there, and they put them in there for a reason. So if it's not useful, then it should be removed.
I agree with that.
So
Sure.
that was my question. It should be
Yeah.
remove it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
And
you.
maybe as it pertains to campgrounds, James, it's not useful, but perhaps there are other places where it is useful.
I think Mike could be
Keep it
right.
defined.
It's more confusing than anything, because what the hell does it mean? Like,
Right.
and it's not used, and there's no standard which says thou shalt determine whether it's light commercial before it goes ahead. So I think Mike's got a point. Because if you're not using it, get rid of it. I like that.
Yep. Further discussion?
Yeah,
Okay, hearing none, we have a motion, and it's been seconded. I'm ready to call roll call vote. Mel,
Yes,
Rick,
Yes,
Mike,
Yes,
Marcia,
Yes,
and I vote yes. So that's 5-0 on that issue. We're moving on to D, which is the planning board erroneously failed to apply the applicable version of the LUO to the AWL 2B proposal.
so Madam Chair,
Yes, James, this
I
is a
would be
biggie.
afraid to jump in for the third time in a row, except that the judge already went through this one extensively in his earlier comments.
Yeah.
Simply want to say that as a legal matter, you've got an excellent analysis by Ms. O'Connell at the planning board as to why this was the same matter and therefore should be treated under the old ordinance. And I don't have much to say on this other than I don't think you should substitute your decision for the planning board. They looked at this item, they turned it upside down. They decided as a matter of law that it was the same application and they proceeded. If you guys want to do it all over, great. I think that's a mistake.
You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about this one too. And I remember, Mike, you asked a really good question. I thought during the public portion, when you basically said, shouldn't this have been a new application? It's so different. And I think Mr. Hamilton suggested that because it was actually a reduction from the first proposal, that it's, you know, it was actually an improvement in so many different ways that the citizens of Tremont had expressed very clearly that they were looking for this kind of reduction. So then I went and I read all this stuff, and so the question to me is, was it a pending application considering all of the changes? That's really is this pending? Was it pending? Can it be considered pending? And in my own thinking, I think so. I think it could be considered pending, but that was just based on, I think, a number of citations that Mr. Hamilton provided. The law sort of leans in that direction. I don't say it's clear as a bell and of course it's pending, but I sort of concluded that after reading all of the information. But let's discuss.
I understand that they didn't make a reduction, but they also added the traffic from AWL 1 from closing off that Kellytown Road. So it wasn't just a reduction, it was definitely a change. I understood that they did declare that the application was complete, but by taking the traffic from another package and putting it through this AWL Lodge, to me, that expanded it and changed it. So I thought that it should have been a new application, is what my feeling was, because it wasn't just a reduction, it was a change and an addition.
I'll weigh in too, and my feelings about this have not changed. It was a significant change in the plans, which in my mind obviated the initial filing, absolutely. It changed almost everything there. It changed the roads, changed the layout. It changed how water is provided. It changed movable and temporary dwellings into 55 plus 11 permanent structures, 1 and 2 bedrooms with baths, heating, hot water, cold water, air conditioning. It changed everything about it. So to pretend that it's the same application, okay, I just think is ludicrous. I mean, you can argue that it's smaller, Well, the fact is that counsel for AWL argued that it was a major change. Look at what we've done. Well, it's a major change, and it changed fundamentally everything about this project. And in my mind, it should have been treated as a new application simply because it was the same people coming back with a totally different idea about what they wanted to do does not constitute a continuation of an initial application. Modify means to make minor changes, and they made major changes, change after change after change after change. So I disagree with your conclusion that it should have been treated as a new application, and the land use ordinance in effect at the time should have been applied to this project.
Madam Chair,
Okay.
I
Rick,
agree
yeah.
with what Mel and Michael have both said, and I would add only one thing, and that is that the changes that were made that Michael just outlined were changes that bear directly on ordinance standards and whether they're satisfied or not. So this was a new deal.
So, James, I don't know if you've gone off the rails there.
I'm making notes. I'm making notes. So maybe I should make
Okay,
notes.
good. Good. I guess I want to understand how liberal does case law guide us in terms of what is considered pending? Can you give us some,
Well,
obviously.
my earlier point was to say that I don't think you should substitute your judgment for that of the board. You which is exactly what you're trying to do. But as far as how liberal you can be, Ms. O'Connell laid all that out in her discussion at the first level. Do you want me to go through that again?
Well, yeah, briefly, just how wide a consideration does pending stand for? I mean, is there any case law where something changed as dramatically as this did, and it was considered pending? For example, if
all kinds of cases.
I'm sorry?
There's all kinds of them. I mean, complex applications like lane construction, for example, down in town of Washington, when they had this big roiling thing that Ed Bear was involved in, they were doing a batch plant and a rock crusher. You know, they were paving between Augusta and Rockland on Route 17. And Washington is on the 220, which goes the other way. And it's on the corner with the 17. So they wanted to do all things. The good folks at the Conservation Law Foundation in the town of Washington didn't want that. So they applied for several things, and it went on for years. Same thing over in Lemoyne with McQuinn, again, Ed Bear, and there was discussion about expansion. So same thing with Ed Bear again and McQuinn in town of Mount Desert. Oftentimes when you have a big application, there'll be several subparts to it, and it'll be changed. And so it's still pending, it's still ongoing. And when you've got a case where there is a necessity for an additional completeness hearing, that's because there's new information or new subparts to it. So I guess you can find whatever you want. And Ms. Chow is shaking her head vigorously, but fortunately we don't get to hear from her because we got her on mute. So I just think it's clear and obvious that it's pending, but more importantly, from my standpoint, is not that judgment. I think what's important is that the planning board reviewed this thoroughly, had advice from council, and made a decision. But if you want to overturn that, then you would say that they made a clear error of law by doing that. That's what you were saying.
Yeah, okay.
I'm just trying to tell you that neither the case law that I know of does not support that.
Okay. So, I'll entertain a motion. Marcia, did you want to weigh in on this one at all?
No, I'd rather listen. Thank you.
Okay. I'll entertain a motion.
Okay, I would move to accept the CTR, oh, yeah, Cambridge, Microsites, TCR, right? Tremont
CTR?
Residence.
Yeah.
Item D, that the planning board erroneously failed to apply the applicable version of the land use ordinance to the AWL 2B proposal. And if we're wrong, we'll find out.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Rick seconds. The only discussion I'll say again is, while, again, setting my feelings apart is the changes in all of this, we are ruling on whether the planning board appropriately found in favor of the applicant here according to law. And they had their attorney there. She provided good information to them. They looked at it. Again, whether pending, what pending really means, I'm probably going to lean the other way on this one. Any other discussion?
I guess, Madam Chair, no, I'm not trying to sway the board, but I just want to remind you.
Come on.
You're not?
Chair asked, and I finally found it. I found it while you were talking.
Oh, good.
Mike's snickering at me. Do you want to finish snickering before I tell you what I found in the MMA?
Yeah,
manual?
you go right ahead, James.
Page 92 and 93 of the MMA Board of Appeals manual under quote unquote pending applications. Pending means that the application has already undergone some substantive review, absent language in an ordinance to the contrary. And then it talks about lane construction and a bunch of the other cases. It talks about what substantive review is. And then it talks about the difference with preliminary review. So that's where I was going to, and the cases are cited therein.
Okay, thank you, James. Any other discussion on this? I'll call for a roll call on this one. The motion is to uphold the appellant's position that the planning board erroneously failed to apply the applicable version of the LUO to the AWL 2B proposal. Mel,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Mike,
You're muted, Mike.
oh, yes, you're muted, Mike.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you. Marcia,
Yes,
and I'm going to vote no on that one. So that is 4-1 in favor of the appellants. All right, we are moving along here to item E, that the planning board improperly delegated authority to the CEO to determine that AWL 2B proposal met the SPRO's approval standards. Any discussion on this one from any board member? When I looked at this, I didn't read it that the code enforcement officer was given authority to approve, but rather to report back to the planning board. So, and that's condition number 6 on the approval. If you read that, it says AWL must meet all state standards as part of review of final design of any and all engineered wastewater systems for the campground, so forth and so on, to the code enforcement officer, who, if satisfied, will recommend and file with the planning board. the demonstration of groundwater at the property line will comply following development, blah, blah, blah. So I didn't find that the CEO could make this approval on his own. I found that he was to report back to the planning board. So
I'm
Go ahead,
sorry. I thought you were done. I'm sorry.
no, I am done.
Okay. I read the same words, and what I was looking for was what's the planning board supposed to do after that? And it doesn't say. And if it doesn't say, there's nothing for the planning board to do. If you'll recall, last week, I questioned Mr. Hamilton about this. What's the planning board's role? And I don't, the record will show, but I don't think he answered the question. The fact is that if the planning board had been authorized by that condition to review the recommendation of the CEO and act on it, that action would have taken place after November 2nd. And that was carefully avoided.
Madam Chair, I have one statement, and I'm assuming this is correct. It was in the record a couple of times. And it references the Tremont town attorney making the statement regarding this specific thing. And it says, and what I would recommend is having it reported to the CEO, and he can make a recommendation to the planning board, and the planning board can meet to accept or reject the recommendation. I do agree that it should be the planning board that makes the final decision. And in this case, it does not look like the planning board reserved unto itself the right to make that final decision. If the CEO accepted it, it was a done deal. He could report it back, but there was no requirement for the planning board to take any action on his report. And it may be a minor point, but I think it's a point that we need to consider. They're supposed to make decisions, and that's what they should do. So in this case, I believe that it's a reasonable objection.
Any other comments on this one? James, did you want to say something that would not influence us?
Oh, Mike doesn't snicker at me again. It's angels on the head of a pin, really, semantics. The board clearly has authority to make conditions, as we discussed earlier. The standard is being reviewed by the state of Maine. The board is in essence delegating to the state of Maine for the standards. And how it's done and whom it reports to, technicalities. It's going to go back to the code enforcement officer, and he's going to give it to the planning board. I think your objection, Mike, is valid but overwrought.
I'm sorry, valid, but what?
Overwrought.
All right, well, I will entertain a motion on issue E, that the planning board improperly delegated authority to the CEO to determine that the AWL2B proposal met the SPRO's approval standards. You're on, yeah.
I'd move
There you
I'd
go,
move
Mike.
that the planning board did not err on letter E for delegating authority. Did not.
It did not err. Okay.
Did
Correct.
not what?
You want- Did not
I
err.
move that the planning
Oh.
board did not err in delegating the authority to the CEO.
I will
Do I have a
second it so
second?
we can go to a vote.
Okay. Any further discussion? It's been moved and seconded. Mel? How do you vote?
Yes, I
Rick,
vote yes.
No.
Mike? Couldn't hear you.
Sorry, no.
Marcia,
Yes, yes, yes.
yes, and I vote yes on this one. So that is 3-2 on issue E, in favor of the applicant. On issue F, which is AWL failed to demonstrate that the AWL 2B proposal will maintain, quote, safe and healthful conditions on Route 102.
I was surprised that there was no cases cited where an applicant was required to demonstrate that conditions outside of their property limits were their responsibility. So I find this a difficult one to support.
Agreed.
Agreed.
On this one, because of the road thing again, and the traffic pattern that all incoming and outgoing visitors, it will include Acadia Wilderness Village as well as Acadia Wilderness Lodge. Because that fact was not taken into account, I have a big old question mark on this page, whether or not that should be taken into account. And our LUO is very vague on what safe and healthful conditions are. I totally agree, extremely vague. But the fact that their deliberations did not include the fact that these 11, the traffic to Acadia Wilderness Village was going to have to be taken into consideration, I was a little uncertain. So I want to throw that out to hear what you guys have to say. Go ahead, Rick.
My problem with it is the vagueness of it. It sounds to me almost as aspirational as light industrial. And I read somewhere, I can't remember where it was, that there have been questions raised as to the unconstitutionality of such a standard because of vagueness. I mean, I don't know how you demonstrate a thing like that. So I would vote that it was not an error for the planning board kind of to slide by that one.
Yeah, I hear you. The vagueness was very troubling. The only standard I could apply was, did they take into consideration the single entrance and egress? And I didn't find that they did. So that's why I was sort of left vague myself.
I think that Johnson or Seawall did do a combined traffic study for safety on Route 102. They included that on their own, and that was part of the record.
Yeah.
And they found no problem.
Yeah, I did see that they did it anyway, even though it wasn't specifically addressed. All right, well, I will entertain a motion.
I move that item F of Tremont Concerned Residents be rejected as not having any basis in the evidence in front of us.
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded to not uphold AWL's failure to demonstrate that AWL 2B proposal will maintain safe and healthful conditions on Route 102. Any further discussion? Okay, Mel,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
Mike,
Yes.
Marcia,
Yes,
and I will vote yes on that one. That's 5-0.
Madam Chair,
Yes, James.
can I seek a little clarity on that? I
Yes,
just wonder the reasons for that vote. I wonder if I see two things here. One possibility is that there is a standard, there's no standard that has to be addressed. I want to know if that's the reason, there's no standard that they have to would have had to have addressed that they didn't address? Or is the reason that there is a standard, but they addressed it? So maybe Mike could tell me which one of those it is.
In my opinion, there's no standard that they have to address.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to get it on the record which one it is that you were voting on.
Yep.
And then, and in addition to that, they did do a traffic study and found that it was not in error.
So what you're saying, Madam Chair, I guess, is if there was a standard, despite what Mike said, then they did address it anyway.
Okay, yeah,
Okay,
Yeah.
I can live with that.
okay. We're heading into the home stretch. To item G. AWL failed to demonstrate that the AWL 2B proposal provides an adequate water system of water supply to the property. Comments?
I have a couple of questions, and I don't know whether it goes to our attorney or to code enforcement officer, but it appears that they use the water recharge capability, the entire 47-acre parcel of land to determine the recharge rate, when in fact less than 20 acres of that land is being used for the campground. And they've already indicated that they plan on developing the remainder of that land. So the question that I really had on this was, you can't count land that you don't own. Can you count land that you've reserved for future development against the water standards? I don't know the answer, so that's why I'm starting out by asking a question.
Good question.
I think the answer in general is no, but whether they did that or not, it would have to have, maybe you could ask Jesse about the methodology, or someone who looked at the record closer than I did.
Jesse, are you able to weigh in on this, Jesse?
The record is
John
pretty
Larson.
clear. They use the entire 47-acre parcel to generate the recharge rate, gallons, whatever you want to call it. But I was just questioning whether they should be allowed to do that.
That, whether they should be allowed to would be, I guess, a question for the engineer and the peer reviewer. I do believe that that is part of the record, that they did use the 47 acres.
I'll jump in again. My view is it may be adequate. The 18.29, it may be adequate, but that wasn't what was used. And I believe that's what should be used. I mean, they were pretty specific about how many acres were allocated to the campground and how many acres were reserved for future development. And I just don't think they should be allowed to count the water recharge on land that they reserve for a future development activity, which they've admitted for the record that they plan on doing.
So, Mike, are you saying, because that was later on in my review, my 2-day marathon review of this stuff. Are you saying that there was no evidence that there was adequate water supply coming from just the area that was going to be developed? That the only way that there was evidence that there would be adequate water is if they included the area that's supposed to be undeveloped? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is the only evidence they provided included all 47 acres. They made no statement at all about the area reserved for the campground itself. They figured all of the recharge on the amount of water that's going to fall on an average year on the 47 acres, not the 18.29 acres. I mean, I read it several times because I got really confused, because there was also the standard about, well, under Maine and drought conditions, it's 60% of normal rainfall. And I didn't know whether it was in there because that was supposed to play a role in it. I mean, there were things that just weren't addressed in the record that I saw.
Well, you've really caught me flat-footed on this because normally what I would say 99.9% of the time is that this is outrageous to question something that's been looked at by, your peer review engineer. But I think you make an excellent point. I mean, normally you'd say the board had lots of evidence in front of it, then they had a peer review. How the hell could you overturn something that was obviously there was lots of evidence on the record? But I missed that altogether, Mike. So I think that's excellent. That it was.
I did too, Mike.
I'm not sure
but-
what the record shows. I don't recall a CTR witness bringing that up.
This was, okay, I'm sorry. This
Go
was
ahead,
in
Mike,
the
I'm sorry.
Fessenden Geotechnical LLC document, September 13th, 2021. And here's what it says. According to US Geological Survey, the average precipitation in the Mount Desert area is 55 inches or 4.6 feet per year. Since the project site is 42.7 acres or 1,860,000 square feet, the calculated precipitation on the site is 8,556,000 cubic feet. And then they go on and they never talk about anything less than the 42.7 acres. So, I mean, and I believe me, I have not, I'm not looking, I was just surprised that they would include land that's not part of the campground and that they had clearly reserved for future development. So that's all.
Mike, if you're, I'm buffaloed here. I mean, what are you saying, that you can't drain water off that site, part of the site? I mean,
No,
you know-
I'm not saying that you can't. I'm just saying it is an area that has been earmarked for future development. Can its rainfall be used
Sure.
for another development? So does that, okay, then the follow on, will that water then be deducted from the balance of the water available in the 42.7 to control what they do with the 20 plus acres that they have reserved for future development? I mean, it's 47 acres that they own. And if my assumption is if they want to include it all for this, they can do it, but they can't reuse it. They can't come back and say, oh, this is a 47 acre parcel and it's this much water. They've already used whatever they've used. They've already.
Isn't that a question when you go for the second application on the other site?
And
Right.
it may be, and my question was, is that since they have clearly said they are reserving 20 acres, should the total water reserves be based on the 42.7 acres or the, roughly 18 acres that the campground itself occupies? And like I said, it started out, that was just a question because I don't know how to look at it.
Well, my answer to you initially was thinking that they were gonna drill on those things, but if they're not gonna drill on them, I'm reminded of in the movie, There Will Be Blood, he says, I suck from your land. I mean, water's gonna run where it does, and I mean, they're not seeking to develop the extra 20 acres, right? They're just measuring how much water they're gonna add.
I understand that, but they have gone on record, and it is in the record that they plan on developing those reserved acres. It's not in any kind of, conservation easement or anything like that. My understanding was they were talking about building houses or something like that.
Yeah, and if and when they do, you can bring that up then.
Okay, fine.
Is it appropriate, Madam Chair, for me to, if Mr. Hayes has that report open, to point to?
No, it's not appropriate.
No, it's not appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, but no, it is not. And I guess I hear what you're saying, Mike, and I think it's a great question, but I think it would have to be addressed if and when those 20 acres come into play. They'll have to meet all the, all the water specifications and all of that. But it's not something I thought about. It's a great question.
It's a great question.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure. here's, when I looked at this question, I was pretty convincing. I think that Haley Ward, who is an independent, is she an engineer? Not sure. Anyway, she works for the town as an independent person, and she said that this was okay, and I didn't find a reason to think that the planning board did not do due diligence on this particular question. I think Mike's question is a good one, but I think it would be addressed if and when that 20 acres comes into play. Other discussion on this particular item? Seeing none, hearing none, I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we determine that the planning board did not err in accepting the evidence supporting the water supply quantity presented by the applicants.
I'll second.
Do I have, Mel seconds? I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on this? Okay. I'm going to call roll call vote. Mel?
Yes,
Rick?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes,
Marcia?
No,
And I vote yes. That would be 4-1. On issue G. All right, Planning Board Council, we have gone through every one of these items presented by the appellant. We have votes recorded. I guess I'm supposed to say this is tentative, pending.
Well, before you do that, I just want to ask Mel. Over the years, Mel has shown himself to be a really smart guy, and I'm wondering, I'd like to know, I don't know about you, Madam Chair, but I'd like to know why Mel wanted to discuss A1 separately from A. Whether he has a burning thought on that.
I thought it was what the proper thing to do, to go through each item that she listed.
But is A1 not part of A? Like they didn't discuss the two of them synchronistically, and wasn't the argument about number one only part of the larger argument about A, or?
Yes, in fact, I saw just about all those as pretty much contingent on the first issue.
Yeah, so do you agree now, though, having reconsidered the last 10 or 15 minutes, that it was right to subsume them all, or do you want to make an individual finding on any particular item?
No, I thought that, to be honest with you, if one of those arguments succeeded, that the petition would pass, and thought it was redundant to go through each individual one, but
That's a different argument, I guess. All right, I just didn't want to feel like we didn't pay attention to you, because you're a smart guy, and I know you come up with some good points.
if you did, it wouldn't bother me.
Actually, I was of the same mind, Mel. I had ignored A altogether and just dealt with A1 and A2 individually. So I had to reorganize my thinking, looking at it as a bigger picture instead of the A1 and A2. So, but I think we've arrived at the same place,
Yeah.
whether we looked at them individually or as a bundle.
So now I think it would be appropriate to have an overall motion, such as move to uphold the appeal.
I move to uphold the appeal as voted on by the appeals board.
I'll second.
Thank you, Mel. Any discussion on the motion to uphold the appeal based on the discussion that we had tonight and the votes that were taken? Hearing none, seeing none. I'm sorry, Ms. Chow. Okay, I will take a roll call vote then. Mel,
Yes. I
Rick,
I vote to approve the appeal,
Uphold.
uphold the appeal.
Rick? You're on mute.
Yes,
Mike,
Yes,
Marcia,
Yes,
and I vote yes. It's 5-0 to uphold the appeal.
Oh, now you have, sorry,
Yeah,
Madam
go ahead.
Chair. Now you have an opportunity to decide what you want to do. And one of the things you could do is you could find that the application is still has merit and is more or less okay, and therefore you could remand it to the planning board to fix specific items, if this is a minor thing. Or you could say the appellant has met their burden of proof. This application is doomed and is so substantially flawed that it should be thrown out.
I object to that framing of the procedural opportunity for the board, Attorney Collier, but I'll desist.
I'm happy if the chair is happy to spend 5 or 10 minutes hearing from Andy and Amy, and if there's any other lawyers involved.
Before I give you the floor, Mr. Hamilton, I want to check with my board. First of all, do you feel that we can make that final vote and either remand this back to the planning board because it has things that needs fixing, or that it is, I think James said, doomed and is completely thrown out? Or do you want to hear from both sides? I will entertain your comments. Mike?
of course. I can't get myself to the point where I think the application is doomed. I think what we've identified are a number of errors that were made. And I think it could go back to the planning board and those errors might be corrected. Again, so much of it hinges on looking at it as one unified application where all of the right standards get applied. I guess the question I might have is one that's much more practical. And nobody's going to answer this question, but sending it back to the planning board may only drag this out for months and months more, and it's still going to end up in court. And that's what scares me. So at any rate, I don't think it's doomed. The land use ordinance allows for campgrounds in the RB zone. I just want to make sure that all of the proper standards and the proper procedures are followed for whatever decision that the planning board ends up making. That's it for me.
I lost my hearing a bit. Did you say one way or the other, Mike, that you would want to hear from the attorneys?
I would like to hear from them. You know, that they have points to make. That's fine with me.
Okay. Mel, Rick, Marcia, anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I'm fine either. I'm fine either way. I certainly would not object to hearing from the attorneys briefly.
Narrowly.
And narrowly, okay. Mel?
I like the word briefly, maybe if the chair could set a time limit for
Certainly.
each person.
Marcia?
I agree with Mel. There should be a time limit set. I don't want us to be here until 10 o'clock.
Gotcha. Okay. Is there a protocol then, James, as to who
Yes,
should
there
go
is.
first?
Yeah, Andy made the objection. Normally, Ms. Chow talks first and then Andy replies, and then Ms. Chow gets the last kick at the apple. But here it was Andy's objection, so Andy talks first, Ms. Chow talks, then Andy can say like 3 words and we'll cut him off.
All right,
So
uh,
the-
Is there
Mr.
a time
Hamilton,
limit?
I'm
That's-
gonna, yes, I'm just gonna let Mr. Hamilton know, I'm gonna be looking at roughly 5 minutes, Mr. Hamilton. And same for Ms. Chow. Wait, Mike, did you have a comment?
No, he's just saying 5.
5. Oh, then we're of the same mind. Go ahead, Mr. Hamilton, you have 5 minutes.
I'll try to be even more brief, Madam Chair. Under Maine law, we have to look at when the Board of Appeals renders its decision because there are a number of procedural gates we have to go through once the Board of Appeals renders its decision. If you were to take a final vote on this appeal as to the course of action that proceeds from here, that's going to trigger a number of clocks. So one thing I want clarification of from the board and its counsel is, are you taking a final vote to render a decision? Because
No, we're gonna do
Yeah,
that later.
that's what I thought was happening, is that you were going to come back together at a later date. I
Yes.
would be more comfortable with that because it seems to me that, Member Hayes said it pretty well. The reason I objected is I don't think this application is doomed. I hear the Board of Appeals wanting to see specific things done. I think there could be a specific remand. Your other 2 options are reversal or vacating the planning board decision overall.
And that's what I meant to say, Andy was vacating.
Yeah, so I vacating requires, and I just want to make sure the standard is in front of the board. Vacating requires that you find that there was no competent evidence in the record to support the Board of Appeals decision. Whether it's Member Cohen, Member Hayes, Member Atherton, the chair, Member Madeira, I didn't hear a single board member say there was no competent evidence in the record to support the decision. And you'll note the reason I'm addressing this is because CTR asked that you vacate the planning board's decision. I don't think you have the factual record to vacate their decision. I further submit, I don't think you intend to reverse. If you intended to reverse, you would have been pretty uniform in adopting all of the CTR claims. The only 2 claims that you've adopted are these 2. You've said that you think that Acadia Wilderness Village, the 11-unit campground, which is already on appeal to the business court and is the subject of pending business court proceedings, which under Maine law vests jurisdiction with the Superior Court and not with this board. I think Member Cohen was starting to get at it when he was asking the question, do we really have jurisdiction over AWV? As to whether the planning board considered all of the evidence as to all standards associated with both campgrounds, the record's clear. There's a 1,600-page record that supports that they did the review. They took a site walk, for instance, on the road.
I don't think we should get into an argument about what or didn't happen. Let's just stick to.
But my point is, you've selected 2 legal issues that may be ripe for a closer examination, both by this board and then the planning board. And if that's all you're doing, which is all that I've heard you do, I think that is tidy for a remand. I don't think that's a reversal or a vacating of the planning board decision. And whereas I still think the appellate review standards of substantial evidence and clearly contrary are very important here, and you've got to come back to them before you render a final decision. I'm pleased that you have tried to do a careful review, and I think you only went off the rails with that first one because there's no current ordinance standard that allows you to combine AWV and AWL. The planning board's in the process of putting that before town voters on May 9th. They haven't done that yet. So if you've got an approved AWV project that was appealed in 2019, the modification was appealed by CTR in 2020. I think that's not in your purview, and that's why I was troubled and thought you went off the rails with that one and not applied the clearly contrary substantial evidence test. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Chow, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will also try to be much less wordy than 5 minutes. I first want to thank the Board of Appeals for a very thorough review and very thorough deliberations here. I know this was a voluminous record and a long proceeding, and I commend to all of you. It seems very clear that you've examined the evidence and the record and the arguments of both sides. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you on behalf of CTR. I want to focus my comments on the issue of what the appropriate remedy is, and focus you on what the ordinance language actually says. And I think if you do that, it'll be clear that what the appropriate action would be is to reverse the decision of the planning board, because AWL needs to submit a new application that includes both projects. The board has already concluded, based on the record evidence, that there were ways in which the AWL2 project did not consider the impacts of AWL1. And I disagree with Mr. Hamilton saying that, well, AWL1 is before the courts. That's true. We're not arguing that. But the unquestionable impacts of AWL1, including the road connection, the single road connection, and the traffic patterns, makes the impacts of the AWL1 site on the AWL2 project material. And the error here that was made that is contrary to the specific provisions of your ordinance are that the applicant chose not to bring that information forward in any meaningful way, so that you were not able to review the impact, the material impact that AWL1 has on the AWL2 project. No one is saying that the standard here is whether it's doomed for a reversal. What your ordinance actually says is that the Board of Appeals may reverse the decision of the planning board upon finding that the decision was contrary to specific provisions of the ordinance or contrary to the facts presented to the planning board. So clearly, the decision was contrary to specific provisions of the ordinance because it did not take into account the AWL1 project. A remand, let me just read you briefly when a remand is appropriate. And none of these standards say, well, is the project doomed? And CTR has never taken the position that no project could occupy this land. But the remand section of your ordinance says that if the Board of Appeals determines that the records of the planning board proceedings are inadequate, the Board of Appeals may remand the matter to the planning board for additional fact finding. And I would submit to you, and I think Mr. Hamilton would agree because he said so multiple times, the record here before you being 1,800 pages long is voluminous. There's no inadequacy in the records here that makes that made the planning board unable to do fact finding. The inadequacy was in AWL not presenting sufficient information about the impacts that AWL1 was going to have on this project. And that we believe warrants a reversal, a straight reversal of the decision, and leave it up to AWL to bring a new application before the planning board that takes into consideration the matters that you have mentioned here today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So just very briefly, Chair, the Board of Appeals ordinance actually says the board has the authority to grant with conditions or deny the appeal. If you were to grant with conditions on the specific two issues that you found, you may want to give Attorney Collier time to craft a recommended or proposed board decision and not render a final vote on this until you can look at that, because there is a way to grant with conditions in part and otherwise deny the appeal. And I think arguing that there has to be a monolithic decision of reversal is actually not what your Board of Appeals ordinance says. It says grant with conditions or deny the appeal. I think you can grant in part with conditions and deny the appeal in greater part. That's what you did.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question, James. One of the issues that we voted 4-1 was whether or not this was reviewed under the proper ordinance the pending issue, if you will.
Yeah, what did you decide on that? I forgot. Now.
Yeah, so what was decided, that was 4-1, that it was under the wrong land use ordinance. Okay, I felt it was pending, and my fellow members felt it was not. So the majority rules, and that alone suggests, I mean, I'm asking you, does that not suggest that this has to go back to the beginning and be reviewed under the land use ordinance, the proper one, according to the Board of Appeals?
Well, that's up to you. I mean, I coming from a long line of fishermen and being 20 years in the boat and can be inartful from time to time. But the way I've always seen it is if you remand, if you can go ahead, give it to the planning board and say, look, you made a couple of mistakes here, or you failed to do these 2 or 3 small things, please do it. It's wholly different in my mind if you send it back to a board and say, oh, yeah, you used the wrong law and you didn't do these major things. This application was done wrong. On the other hand, if you look at the planning board, you know, the fact that they've made a mistake, which is the thing that they've used, that's challenging because I'm going to talk myself in a circle here, because the applicant is going to say, well, we submitted the information. It's up to the planning board to make that decision. And if they had said that the new amendments were in effect, we would have submitted a new application. So I don't know, that's confusing as hell. You know where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I hear you. But this board found that the planning board erred.
Yeah,
And
you support them because majority rules.
right. So, as Mike would say, what is our next step? I mean, we're saying
Well, if you're going to remand, you have to be able to remand in a way that is clear and understandable for the planning board. And what you're going to say is, we love you, planning board, you do a good job. However, you made the following errors in how you did everything. So, for example, okay, on point number 1, what you would do is you would say, you know, you should have considered the 2 of them together. So we want you, planning board, to review it again. And the applicant and the neighbors will have comment on it, but look specifically at what would happen with the other part and the people going through and water usage and pedestrian and so on. Or, for example, you might say, you know, we decide that you should have looked at the safety of pedestrians on the highway. We want you to go look at that. Those are remand issues that I think are pretty easy to do. They're discrete, they're narrow. You can tell the board what to do, give them a specific mission, and it's pretty easy for both the applicant and the neighbors to comment on it. No fuss, no muss, not that hard.
what about using the, a different ordinance?
Challenging. It's very challenging because what you end up having to say is, we love you, planning board. However, you used the wrong ordinance because, and then you have to say it wasn't pending. And I think what you have to do then is you have to say, if it wasn't pending, it's a new application. Because then if it's a new application, well, start over. I think they start over because they've got to gear themselves up to all of the standards using the new application. And I don't know, maybe one of you people can do it faster than I can. And I don't think we should do it at this late hour, but I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are numerous items in the revised amended ordinance from the next year that would have changed, such as setbacks or something. So it would be unfair to the applicant I mean, I would think that they would want to have Mr. Johnson go back and, for example, with the setbacks, make sure they were okay with those, or if there was more buffering that was required, the applicant and his engineer would want to show how that more buffering would be in place. I mean, it would be exceedingly difficult to tell the planning board they had to use a different ordinance with different standards, then restrict the applicant to the same application that they already had. See what I mean?
Can I ask a question, please? And I'm not, it just always looks like I smirk, James. I really don't smirk.
Well, you're in the dark there. Your thing's so dark, I can't see what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm letting the dark side show. It appears to me that we have eliminated one of the three options. Okay, we are not going to deny the appellants in all
Right.
cases, right?
Yeah.
So we're either back to vacate or remand, correct? I mean, those seem to be the only two options we got.
No, you can vacate the decision of the planning board. Yeah,
Right, vacate or remand it back, make these changes, do it
Right.
this way.
that's right.
This is going to be a multiple part question. And I hate to spend the town's money, but I'm wondering if you could not draw up for this board a short document that would express both of those. What the wording would be and what its implications are
Sure.
for
Well, what you-
us. And then, Madam Chair, maybe I really hate to do this. We continue this meeting for another week and if the attorney can get us that material within, that week, we can come back and make a final decision.
I can't do that.
Okay.
I can't do it within a week because next week is school vacation. Remember,
You're still in school?
my wife's a French teacher, and we have to go to Quebec so she can brush up on her French.
We can wait.
The
But
next,
other than that, it's not an unreasonable way to proceed.
no, I mean, there's a third option that Andy was driving at, which I don't think is applicable. And what he's saying, driving at, I think, is you could uphold the appeal, but then go ahead and let it go ahead with, and make conditions on the it going ahead. So, yeah, there are two different things, vacate or remand, and how you do it.
Madam
I
Chair,
feel
can I
more
ask,
comfortable going that route.
May I
Yeah,
ask?
and you could also
Mr.
have-
Collier a question?
I'm sorry,
Mr.
but you could also
Collier,
have the findings of fact and conclusions of law. If you send it off like a couple weeks, I could probably get those done too. And then you could make your final decision at that time, decide to vacate or remand, and vote on the findings, of fact, conclusions of law, do it all in the same meeting.
Rick?
Mr. Collier, is there a short way of answering this question?
Oh, everything's short.
Yeah. Whether or not if we just reverse the planning board, period, without remanding, under what circumstances could the applicants make a new application with whatever adjustments they think they might want to make?
Boy, I'd have to do some research on that. I know they can't do it right away. There has to be material change. Here, there's material change, all right? There's a new amended thing that came in.
I don't think, am I wrong? I had the impression that the May amendments were not that strenuous or that
I don't know.
weren't going to make that big change, necessitate big changes for the applicant. I don't know. That's the impression I had. I see Jesse is going yes or no. Mr. Hamilton, don't say a word, but am I correct about that?
I think Jesse is saying that you are correct. Is that right, Jesse?
Yeah.
That's correct.
All right.
So that may not be a big problem.
Okay. And that's a good point, Rick. I mean, if they did us, if they checked those things that changed and see whether or not that had an impact on the application, if it's not a big deal, then it shouldn't be onerous. So I like that plan that Mike put out there, James, that you could put together two different decisions for us, one to remand, one to vacate.
What he asked was, what are the implications of each one? I can do that if you want, but I thought what he was saying was what to do a memo to say, what are the implications of each one? Do you want me to,
Right.
you want me to
Right.
write an actual decision too?
Well, I think once we know the ramifications, I think we'd be ready to make a final decision. Is that fair, board members?
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think if our attorney wrote it up, there wouldn't be any arguments about, is this really the right wording or the wrong wording, or what was said and that sort of thing.
Everything I write is perfect, Mike.
I absolutely believe you.
I'm not as good verbally, but written, I'm really good.
I absolutely believe you. So I would suggest that we continue this hearing for 2 weeks. Would that give you enough time?
Yeah,
You know,
All right,
and then,
would everybody kind of look at the 28th, April 28th, Thursday, 5 o'clock? I am free.
I'm okay.
There is a harbor committee meeting.
I also have an immovable conflict just that evening, but otherwise open that week.
how about Wednesday?
no,
Oh, ooh, sorry.
Thursday was pushing it. I gotta get back from vacation and do this stuff. It's spring, my friend. It's buying season. I'm a real estate lawyer. There's annual reports. I mean, I love you guys, but there's a limit to there's only so much of me to go around.
How about May 5th?
Yeah, that's good.
That
I'm available.
doesn't.
I'm available as well.
That's okay.
Love it.
Margaritas for all my friends.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I do have plans, but we'll make that work. We'll make that work. All right, so now we are looking at May 5, 5 o'clock.
Madam Chair, point of order, can I ask a quick question at whenever it's convenient?
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Chow.
Okay, thank you. Just asking if Mr. Collier is preparing draft findings, either way for the board's consideration on May 5th. Would the board entertain receiving draft findings from both the attorneys on both sides?
No, well, the board can do whatever it wants, but normally what we do in this sort of circumstances, I draft them. I'll send them to you and Andy. And you'll comment, tell me how great they are. And then I send them to the here.
Okay, so you'll be drafting those on your own. You'll be sending them to Mr. Hamilton
Yeah.
and myself.
If you think I'm way off base, you can try to influence me by writing and saying, maybe you could do this rather than that. That way I control it and the board doesn't have to look at 3 versions. Unless the chair wants to look at 3 versions.
No, thank you. I also want to say how much I appreciate all of you for doing the due diligence that this case required. It's certainly been a journey and it's not over. And I know that both sides would like to see resolution and we're trying to get there. Truly, we are. So I think I don't know if I need a motion, James, to turn this work over to you, or can we just? Yes.
Yeah. I think before you do that, though, I want to ask one question about. Someone asked about whether they could do another application. Do you want me to research that as well?
That would be interesting to know.
Okay.
Yes, I would.
Can there be another application, and if so, when and under what conditions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll make a small presentation on that. Now, I think, Madam Chair, to answer your question, it's moved to have the town attorney prepare findings of fact and conclusions of law consistent with our votes this evening. And to write a memorandum to the board. And write the memorandum to the board about the distinction between vacating a decision and remanding the decision. That's the second thing. And to write a decision, the starts of a decision, to remand, and a decision for vacation. Is that a
So
word?
moved.
Mike moves that soliloquy. Do I have a second?
I'll second it, but can I ask a question about Mr. Collier?
Yes, I have a motion and it's been seconded. Go ahead, Rick. You have a question.
Mr. Collier, are you listening?
I am.
Oh, good. The question is this, somebody was making a distinction earlier between vacating and reversing. I don't know whether the motion, as you worded it, makes that distinction or not.
No, because it's not, reversing is not relevant. So what you end up doing is, the only reason you reverse is you reverse the decision of the planning board and vacating. So it's semantics.
Okay, so so it's not two different kinds of rejections. I mean, it's not a choice we have to make then.
I don't think so, no. Not that I
Okay,
remember
good,
it.
good, good, good.
7:30 after 2.5 hours.
Fine.
Okay, I have a motion.
Hung up on labels, you know.
I have a motion that's been seconded to have James do this work on our behalf. Any further discussion or questions on that? Hearing none, seeing none.
I have a question.
Yes, Marcia, yes.
When can we pick this information up?
I gather that James is going to email some of this to us. Is that right, James?
Yeah.
All right. And Jesse, you'll have hard copies if any board members want them. And that won't happen before week after this coming.
Oh, yeah, that's something like that. I mean, it'll be in time, so it won't jam you up at the last minute. If you're talking May 5th, that's on a Thursday.
Yes,
So I'm thinking second.
at the latest.
Yeah, the latest. I'm thinking 29th at the earliest and the second at the latest. But sometime between Friday and Monday, and I don't work on Sundays. So somewhere in there, I'll email it to Jesse. And Jesse will make sure that it's emailed to the board.
Thank you. And Jesse, just let us know if we can come by for hard copies. There's some of us like that. Okay.
And once I email it to Jesse, all you got to do is print it out because it'll be.
Understood. Some have printers and some don't. So,
Yeah.
okay. Any other business?
Yes.
We need
You
to
have
vote.
to move that. If it's not obvious to everyone, it should be that your decision tonight was not final.
Okay. I have a motion that our decisions tonight are not final. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. Any discussion on that point? Hearing none, seeing none. All in favor, please raise your hand. It's unanimous.
And do you need a motion to continue this meeting on to
Yes.
May 5th at
Yes,
5
please.
p.m.? I so move.
Thank you, Mike. Do I have a second?
Second.
Rick seconds. Any discussion? Hearing none, seeing none. All in favor, please raise your hand. It's unanimous. I can now, yes, James.
I just missed number 4 here. I've got findings of fact, conclusions of law, write a memo regarding the difference between vacate and remand, write a decision to vacate and a decision to remand, And then there was a fourth item, which was,
How soon the application can be,
oh, yeah. When can application? Okay, thank you.
you're welcome. If there's no other business, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
I've got a second. Any discussion? I just want to thank you once again. I will see you, if not before Cinco de Mayo. I will see you at Cinco de Mayo. Until then, be well, be safe. All those in favor of adjourning, please raise your hand. It is unanimous. Thanks very
Thank you,
much,
Joanne.
everybody.
Did a great job.
Oh, thank you.
See ya.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.